Recording in progress.
Good morning. Good morning to you all, and welcome back after our August break. It's good to see you all here. So I apologize for the rough start with the screen share. The screen share function on Zoom works beautifully if you follow the routine. But if you deviate from the routine, it lands you in a place that's as far apart as heaven and earth, and that's what I had to recover from. But I'm glad you are all willing to put up with that. We're starting off in a fresh with a. I thought we'd start with a teaching of Zen Master Dogen. It's a teaching that has been popular recently, especially among those interested in and concerned about the environment. It's called the Mountains and Rivers Sutra. And it's relatively long. It's longer than other things we've talked about, and I don't think we'll go through it line by line. It would take over a year to do so. But perhaps some selections from it to just give a taste of this remarkable work. I think I'll start by just reading the initial passage from the Mountains and Rivers Sutra, as translated by Kaz Tanahashi. Mountains and waters are right now the actualization of the ancient Buddha way, each abiding in its phenomenal expression realizes completeness. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive at this moment. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation realization. So that's a lot to take in a very short passage. So I thought I would talk a little bit about some background. So this fascicle, it's what Dogen referred to as the parts of his main book, the Shobogenzo. It is really kind of a poetic essay, something between an essay and a poem. It was composed when he was 40 years of age. So he was a mature practitioner at this time. Other things that we've studied regarding Master Dogen, or that he wrote earlier in his life, in his late 20s, but he was 40 at the time he composed this. And I think it's helpful to reflect on the fact that 13th century Japan was predominantly rural. Most people lived in the country, and Japan is about 80% mountainous. It was formed from, as I understand it, geologically from the Pacific Plate and the Asian continental plate colliding and pushing up through the ocean to form mountainous peaks. So and at that time, people got from place to place usually by walking. Some people had um, carriages and carts and various things like that, but most people got from one place to another by walking. So walking through the mountains and walking, with over bridges, covering rivers, crossing rivers was just very routine for them. For us, it's sort of, especially people in the urban areas and suburban areas, it's kind of something you might do on vacation. But this was something it was an everyday activity. And there was an understanding that mountains and rivers were connected. Actually, the Japanese name for the writing is Sansui Kwo. San meaning water, sui meaning san meaning mountain, sui meaning water, and Kwo meaning sutra. And there was an understanding that mountains and rivers were related. The rivers formed because of the mountains, the watershed, water collecting in the valleys and forming rivers. And in turn, the rivers molded the mountains, the water over time shaping the mountains and changing the mountains. Another thing in terms of background is that this is called the Mountains and Rivers Sutra, but it's not it's not a sutra about mountains and waters. It's a sutra, he's talking about a sutra by mountains and waters. What the mountains and waters are telling us if we have ears to listen. Sutra refers to teachings of the Buddha. And the case that Dogen is making here is that if we have the right view, the right perceptual approach, if we have ears to listen and eyes to see, the mountains and the waters are speaking the words of the Buddha. There is another fascicle that Dogen wrote just a few months before this one. This was a time, the last 10 to 12 years of his life, he was very prolific in his writings, and he wrote another fascicle that addresses a similar point, and in that he quotes a poem which I think was the seed for both of these writings of Dogen. So we'll go back to that. And this is a poem by Su Dangpo, and Dogen quotes it in his fascicle called Valley Sounds, Mountain Colors. Valley sounds are the long, broad tongue. Mountain colors are no other than the unconditioned body. 84,000 verses are heard through the night. What can I say about this in the future? Valley sounds are the long, broad tongue. A long tongue is one of the signs of a Buddha, so he's referring to the Buddha's tongue. Mountain colors are no other than the unconditioned body, which would be the Buddha body. 84,000 verses are heard through the night. There are said to be 84,000 sutras. So he's referring to sutras. the teachings of the Buddha, 84,000 teachings. What can I say about this in the future? So, as Buddhism arising in northern India, moving into China, and then being transplanted into Japan, it, as we've talked about before, took on the colors of the cultures through which it passed. And the notion of Buddha, originally confined to that the Buddha was a human being, lived 500, in the 500 years before the Common Era, and lived for 80 years, and had a series of lectures and teachings, and the Buddha died. So that was what was meant by the Buddha. But as time went on, the notion of Buddha just became more transcendental. And in subsequent teachings and subsequent writings in Buddhism, as they filtered in through northern India and into China, there was this notion of Buddha nature, of the Buddha-ness of other beings, of humans, of non-human sentient beings, and even of non-sentient things, grasses and trees, rocks, mountains, rivers. So the notion of Buddha became transcendental and all-pervasive in the writings, especially the more poetic writings. And as time went on, the writings became more and more poetic. So with that little background, I think we'll go back to the first section of Mountains and Rivers Sutra. Mountains and waters are right now the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. So these things in our environment, what we see and hear, the sound of waters in a brook, the color and shape of mountains, are an expression of the Buddha if we are observant enough to perceive them that way, each abiding in its phenomenal expression. Phenomenal expression is sometimes translated as Dharma position. Dharma position refers to the fact that even though everything is interconnected, there is a place for each thing and a function for each thing. So that the mountains are mountains, realizing completeness as mountains. The rivers are rivers, realizing their completeness as rivers. The mountains need not compare themselves with rivers. The rivers need not compare themselves with mountains. Each occupies its Dharma position. Another way of saying this is that each plays its part. Each separate thing plays its part, but each separate thing is not really separate. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, in traditional Buddhist teachings, there are four eons. There's the empty eon, in which the Buddha appears, and then there's the arising eon, when the teachings are spread. There's the abiding eon, when the teachings are practiced, and there is the declining eon, when the teachings are forgotten. And this operates cyclically through eon after eon. But he's saying that mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, before time. They are alive at this moment. We won't get into this because it would be too difficult. But Dogen has an unusual, for us, notion of time, in which the present really contains all the past and all the future. And we can talk about that some other time when I'm feeling stronger. But that he's referring to the fact that before there was even time, the mountains and waters have been active, and they are alive at this moment. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation realization. They have been fully a part of the world as we perceive it since before form arose. They are the path to realization. And Dogen goes on through the remainder of this writing to explicate this in various ways, which we'll get to. I found it helpful to refer back to a very early and fundamental teaching of the Buddha in the Dhammapada in thinking about this. The very first verse of the Dhammapada goes something like this. There are a number of translations, of course. We are what we perceive with the mind. All that we are arises in mind. With our mind, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and suffering follows, as the wheels follow the ox that pulls the cart. We are what we perceive with the mind. All that we are arises in mind, and with our mind we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness follows, as a shadow, unshakable. So there have been a number of comparisons between Buddhist teachings and modern quantum physics and various things, but I think fundamentally the Buddha was interested in the problem of being a human, and specifically the suffering associated with human existence, and came to understand that a lot of it has to do with how we look at things. There are scientists who understand, who study how various organisms perceive the world. Various organisms have different sense organs than we do. Obviously, they have some kind of consciousness or something. They have something that directs their behavior. And but it's different from what we have. For instance, mosquitoes have infrared vision. It's like these night the night view cameras. They can spot heat and accurately. We can feel heat when we get close enough to it, but it's kind of, our senses of heat are rather vague. But the mosquito has just a needle sharp sense of heat detection. And that's a useful characteristic for an organism that feeds on blood. It can find warm bodies quickly and accurately, and can actually find the warmest part of the body. And that's where there's the greatest blood flow. So a term that is used to describe these different ways that organisms perceive their environment, perceive the world, is a German term called Umwelt. Meaning like surroundings or around, and Welt meaning world. How they see the world. The Buddha perceived that humans have the capacity to perceive the world in many different ways. And there are certain practices that can help us perceive the world in a way that does not lead to as much pain and suffering. The human default mode, at least in adulthood, seems to be to perceive the world in which we are a separate self, and if we can just get what we want and just avoid what we don't want, we will be happy. The Buddha recognized through his experience and through his practice that was a fallacy, that way of perceiving the world did not, in fact, lead to happiness, but actually led to suffering. So in this fascicle, Dogen is talking about perceiving our surroundings as Buddha, perceiving the mountains as the Buddha body, and the rivers as the long tongue of Buddha. How would that change the way we interact with our environment? Vastly, vastly. In West Virginia and Kentucky, there are 500 mining sites where they have done what's called mountaintop mining. They've essentially used bulldozers to clear the tops off of mountains, the total surface area being the size of the state of Delaware for all these 500 sites, in order to get coal. If we perceive the mountains as the body of Buddha, could we possibly do that? No, we couldn't do that. That sort of activity can only be accomplished with a certain view of the world. So this Mountains and Rivers Sutra has been taken up by environmentalists as kind of an environmentalist tract. And I think in a sense it is, but it's not just that. It includes that, but it's much larger. So how would our view of the world be different if, as Dogen says, people seem to think that there is no Buddha Dharma in the secular world, but what they fail to see is that there is no secular world in the Buddha Dharma. Now, in our current experience, in our everyday life here in St. Louis anyway, we see a lot more buildings and streets than we do mountains and waters. But I think the image still holds. There could be a buildings and streets sutra. What would it be like? So I think we'll stop there with those musings and separate into smaller groups and get back together in a few minutes. Let me see.